Queen Alina sat on her throne, her eyes cold and steady as the hall filled with the voices of mocking men. They stood before her dressed in fine armor, their banners shining, their mouths full of laughter. They mocked her land, her soldiers, and her crown. They said her people were weak. They said her throne was made for a woman too afraid to fight. The words carried through the stone walls like poison. Daniel stood at her side, his hand tight on the hilt of his sword. He felt the sting of every insult, as if they were meant for him. Beside him, Claire clenched her fists. Matthew, younger but no less loyal, lowered his eyes, trying to hide his anger. They were soldiers of Queen Alina, and they would die for her if she asked. But they had no answer for the cruel words of the lords who came only to mock. The lords laughed about her armies. They said her men could not stand a day in battle. They said her villages would fall like dry wood in fire. One of them leaned close and whispered that she was queen, only because the world had no one else. His grin was sharp as he bowed low, not out of respect, but to show that he thought she was nothing. Their laughter shook the hall. Alina did not answer with words. She sat silent, her hands folded tight, her eyes never leaving theirs. She listened until the sound of their voices grew heavy and cruel. She watched until even Daniel's face burned red with rage. Then, with a calm voice that cut through the laughter, she told them to leave her hall. They thought they had one. They bowed with mock smiles and left, still laughing as their boots struck the stone. When the hall was empty, Daniel turned to her, his voice hot with anger. He asked why she let them speak to her that way. Claire said she could have ordered their heads struck from their shoulders. Matthew said no one should be allowed to insult their queen and walk free. But Alina only raised her hand and told them to hold their tongues. She said the time for words had ended, and the time for deeds was close. Daniel frowned. He wanted blood now. He wanted to show the lords that her crown was not weak. Claire wanted the same. She was sharp and fierce, ready to march with sword in hand. Matthew, though young, said he would follow her into fire if she asked it. But Alina only said they must be patient. She told them of the secret that had slept beneath the forests for many years. She said the day would come soon when the world would learn why her crown still stood. They had heard old tales whispered in villages. Stories about beasts hidden away long ago. Stories about the foxes of war, creatures bred for battle and feared by kings. None of them had thought the tales were true, yet Elena's eyes told them she believed, and her voice carried the weight of command. She said their enemies would soon see what true power looked like. That night, in her chamber, Alina stood by the window and looked out at the dark horizon. Torches of enemy camps burned in the distance, their laughter still echoing in her mind. They thought she was weak. They thought she was nothing. But she had seen the records kept by her ancestors. She had read of the foxes locked away when men grew afraid of their own creation. She knew the cages still stood in the deep forests. She knew it was time to open them again. In the barracks, Daniel spoke with Claire and Matthew. They whispered about the queen's words, their voices low. Daniel said he would follow her into the forest if she ordered it. Claire said she had no fear, that if the foxes were real, they would fight beside them. Matthew, though uneasy, agreed. They all swore to keep her secret and to carry out her command when the moment came. Outside the walls, the mocking lords gathered their armies. They told stories of how Queen Alina had sat in silence, too weak to answer them. They said she would fall in days. They prepared their men for a war they believed already won. But in the silence of the night, in the shadow of the trees, the true war was only beginning. The queen's plan had started, and the foxes of war would soon rise again. The sun had not yet risen when Queen Alina sent for Daniel, Claire, and Matthew. The hall was empty and quiet, the air heavy with the weight of her words the night before. When they arrived, she stood in her armor, not in her royal gown. Her crown was set aside. She looked less like a queen and more like a commander about to march into battle. Her voice was sharp and firm. She told them the time had come to uncover what had been hidden. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Had dreamed of this moment, but never thought it would come so soon. Claire's eyes shone with a hard fire, her hand on her sword hilt. Matthew's voice shook when he said they were ready, but he did not back away. Alina told them the path would not be easy. She said the forest was wild and dark, filled with dangers not seen for many generations. Yet if they wished to defend their people, they must walk it with her. Before dawn, they left the castle by a hidden gate. Only a handful of soldiers joined them, men and women who had sworn their lives to Alina and who would not speak of what they saw. The road into the forest was narrow, tangled with roots, and silent. Birds did not sing there. The deeper they went, the more the trees grew thick, shutting out the light. Daniel led at times, sword ready. Claire stayed close to Alina, her shield raised, while Matthew kept watch behind. For hours they marched, until at last they came to ruins of stone covered in moss. Towers broken by time rose from the ground like teeth. Alina raised her hand and all fell still. She said this was the place spoken of in the records. Beneath the earth, hidden by her ancestors, were the cages of the foxes of war. She said they were not myths. She said they were real. Matthew's throat went dry. He had heard stories as a boy, but standing there among the ruins made the tales feel alive. Claire stepped forward and pushed aside the vines, finding an entrance that led down into darkness. The air smelled of rust and dust, old and heavy. Daniel lit a torch and led the way inside. The walls were carved stone, marked with words long faded. The floor sloped downward, and the silence pressed on them like a weight. They reached a great door of iron. Its edges were worn, its locks covered in dust, but it still stood strong. Alina stepped forward. She placed her hand upon it, and her voice echoed in the dark as she spoke words from the old texts she had studied. The soldiers looked at one another, uneasy, yet they held their ground. With a groan, the door opened, and stale air rushed out like breath held for centuries. Inside, they found rows of cages, their bars thick as tree trunks. Bones of men lay scattered near them, broken armor rusting where it had fallen. Out. But within the cages, shadows moved. Eyes glowed red in the torchlight. The foxes were there, larger than wolves, their fur bristled, their fangs sharp, their bodies tense as if they had been waiting all this time. A low growl filled the chamber, one that made Matthew stumble back, his heart pounding. Daniel held his torch high. He did not step back. Claire drew her blade, though she knew steel alone would not stop such creatures. Alina moved closer, her face calm, though her eyes burned with fire. She said the foxes remembered. They remembered war. They remembered the bond with the crown. She spoke again in the old tongue, her words slow and clear. The growling faded. The foxes pressed against the bars, their eyes fixed on her. One cage creaked open, the lock breaking as if it had never been meant to last. A fox stepped forward, its head low, its teeth bared. Daniel raised his sword, but Alina lifted her hand and stopped him. The fox did not strike. It walked past him and knelt before her, its eyes still red but its growls softening. Another followed, then another, until the chamber shook with the sound of claws on stone. The soldiers whispered in fear, but Alina raised her voice above them. She said the time had come for the foxes to rise again, to fight not as beasts, but as the shield and sword of her people.
Ow.
The foxes howled as if answering her call. Their cries echoed through the ruins, carrying into the forest above. Daniel felt his heart race. Claire gripped her blade with a smile. Even Matthew stood taller, his fear replaced by awe. The queen turned to her soldiers. She told them the war ahead would not be easy, but with the foxes at their side, they would no longer bow to those who mocked them. She swore that her people would rise, and the world would tremble when it heard the name of the foxes of war. The soldiers raised their swords, and the foxes roared. The silence of the forest was broken, and the age of fear had ended. The night was heavy with silence, when Queen Alina and her soldiers returned from the ruins. The foxes followed them like shadows, their red eyes glowing in the dark. Every soldier felt fear in their bones, yet none dared to speak it aloud. They knew the creatures were wild, but they also knew the queen had bound them to her will. For the first time, Daniel felt hope stir in his chest. Claire walked with her chin high, her hand on her blade, ready for what was to come. Matthew kept looking over his shoulder at the foxes, both afraid and amazed that such beasts now walked beside them. By dawn, word had reached the enemy that Elena's men were on the move. They thought it was only a small force, foolish to march without the rest of her armies. The mocking lords sent their riders to crush her and to bring her head as proof of her weakness. Hundreds of armored men rode with banners high, laughing at the thought of easy victory. They believed it would be a short fight. Daniel and Claire led the queen's small force to the edge of a valley. The sun rose behind them, casting long shadows across the grass. Alina gave the order to stand fast. The enemy came in waves, their horses thundering against the earth, their voices raised in cruel laughter. They saw only a few soldiers and thought it would be slaughter. They did not see the foxes hidden in the brush. The riders charged. Daniel gripped his sword, his heart steady. Claire lifted her shield and shouted for the line to hold. Matthew's hands trembled as he readied his spear. The ground shook as the enemy closed in. Then Alina raised her arm high. With a sharp cry, she brought it down, and the foxes were unleashed. The beasts sprang from the shadows with a roar that split the air. Their speed was faster than arrows. They struck the riders before they could lower their lances. Horses screamed as foxes tore into their flesh. Men were dragged from saddles, their armor ripped open as if it were cloth. The enemy's laughter turned to shouts of fear. Banners fell, and blood stained the grass. Daniel fought at the front, cutting down men who tried to flee the snapping jaws. Claire smashed her shield into a rider and struck him down with her blade. Matthew thrust his spear into a man who had fallen, his fear burning into anger. The foxes moved in packs, circling their prey, striking fast and vanishing before another blow could land. They were not beasts of chaos, but soldiers of nature, bred for war and death. The mocking lords had thought the queen weak. They saw their riders broken in minutes. Men who had boasted of victory now fled for their lives, chased by foxes that hunted them down without mercy. Some tried to rally, but the sight of red eyes and snapping jaws crushed their will. The valley was filled with screams and the sound of steel breaking. When the last rider fell, the battlefield was quiet. But for the panting of the foxes, they stood in the blood-soaked grass, their fur matted, their eyes still glowing. Not one soldier of Elena's force had fallen. Daniel lowered his sword, his breath heavy, and looked to his queen. Claire's armor was stained red, her shield cracked, but her smile fierce. Matthew dropped to his knees, shaking from the fight, but alive. Alina raised her chin and spoke loud enough for all to hear. She said the world would never mock her people again. She said the foxes of war had returned, and no crown or army could stop them. The soldiers cheered, their voices raw. The foxes howled, their cries echoing across the valley like thunder. The enemy survivors who had escaped would carry tales of this day back to their lords. They would speak of the queen who walked with beasts, and the soldiers who fought with them as one. They would speak of the foxes that tore through armor and flesh alike, leaving no mercy for those who mocked. Daniel stood among the bodies and knew the war had truly begun. The foxes had tasted blood again, and nothing could hold them back. Claire said the lords would gather greater armies now. Matthew whispered that he feared what would come, but he swore he would fight. Alina looked at them all, her voice steady. She said, "Let them come. Let them bring every man they have. The foxes of war would be waiting." Smoke rose from the valley where the foxes had torn through the riders. The ground was dark with blood, and broken banners lay scattered like fallen leaves. The survivors who had fled carried fear back to their lords. By the next day, the stories had already begun to spread. Men whispered of red-eyed beasts that fought like demons. Some laughed and called it lies. Others shivered and believed every word. Either way, the name of Queen Alina was now spoken with dread. In the castle, Daniel cleaned his blade, his mind heavy with what he had seen. The foxes fought with a fury beyond men, yet there was a strange order to them, as if they still remembered the battles of old. Claire sharpened her shield edge and told him they had seen only the beginning. She said the lords would gather stronger forces, but she felt no fear. Matthew sat close, silent, his hands shaking as he tried to mend his spear. He said the foxes were both a blessing and a curse. Daniel asked him what he meant, and Matthew said he saw in their eyes a hunger that could one day turn on them as well. Queen Alina called her soldiers together. She spoke of the victory, but also of the cost that was coming. She said the lords would not stop. They would join together and march with all their strength. She told her men they must be ready, not only to fight, but to control the foxes when the bloodlust grew too strong. Her words struck deep, for even as the soldiers cheered, they knew Matthew's fear was true. Scouts soon brought news. A great army was marching, far larger than the riders they had faced. Banners from many lands had gathered. The lords who had mocked Alina now trembled, but instead of bowing, they sought to crush her before her power grew too great. They carried fire, steel, and the promise of no mercy. Villages loyal to Alina were burned, and her people dragged away in chains. The cries of the helpless reached the castle walls. Alina sent Daniel, Claire, and Matthew with the foxes to strike at the enemy outposts. She said they must move fast, hit hard, and vanish before the larger army could react. Daniel led the raids with steel in hand. The foxes moved with him, tearing down gates and cutting through guards as if they were nothing. Claire's shield broke through lines, and Matthew, though still uneasy, fought with courage as the foxes circled him like guardians. One by one the outposts fell, and the enemy began to fear the shadows more than the soldiers. But with each raid, the foxes grew wilder. They did not always wait for orders. Sometimes they killed beyond what was needed, leaving fields painted red long after the enemy was broken. Daniel began to notice their eyes glowing brighter, their growls louder. He told Alina of this, but she only said they must press on. She said the foxes were born for war, and war was what they would give. One night, as the soldiers rested by a ruined tower, a pack of foxes returned from a hunt. Blood dripped from their jaws, yet no enemy lay nearby. Matthew trembled as he whispered that they had turned on the wild deer, tearing them apart as if they were soldiers. Daniel felt a chill, but Claire argued it did not matter, for they were beasts of war, not tame pets. Still, the thought weighed heavy on them all. The enemy army grew closer each day. Thousands marched together, their torches lighting the night like stars of fire. The mocking lords no longer laughed. Their faces were grim, their voices sharp, but their pride drove them forward. They believed that numbers would break the queen, no matter what beast she commanded. They prepared for a battle that would decide the fate of the lands. Queen Alina stood before her people on the castle walls. She told them that the world thought them weak, that for years they had been mocked and beaten down. But she said no more. She raised her sword high and swore that the foxes of war would lead them to victory. Her soldiers roared back, and the foxes howled at the sky, their cries chilling the hearts of all who heard them. In the distance, the enemy campfires spread across the hills like rivers of flame. Daniel tightened his grip on his sword. Claire smiled with iron in her eyes. Matthew whispered a prayer. Elena's gaze never wavered. The storm of war was close, and the foxes of war hungered for it. The night before the great battle was heavy with tension. The enemy army camped across the hills, their fires stretching farther than the eye could see. Thousands of men stood ready to march on Queen Elena's lands. Their lords spoke of crushing her in one strike and ending the rise of her power. They believed numbers alone would break her crown. Inside the castle walls, the soldiers sharpened blades and prayed in silence. Foxes prowled restlessly, their eyes burning red in the torchlight. Daniel walked along the walls, watching the enemy fire glow in the distance. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, his mind heavy with the task before them. Claire joined him, her shield strapped to her back. She said the enemy would attack at dawn, and that their lines would shake the earth itself. Daniel agreed, but added that the foxes were their answer. Claire gave a sharp smile, saying she trusted the beasts more than the men they fought beside. Matthew came to them, his face pale in the firelight. He said he feared the foxes were slipping beyond their control. He had seen them grow wilder with each raid, their hunger unending. Daniel argued that fear was natural before battle, but Matthew shook his head. He said fear of the enemy was one thing, but fear of their own allies was another. Alas, Claire brushed off his words, saying war was no place for doubt. Still, Daniel knew Matthew spoke truth. Queen Alina gathered her commanders in the great hall. Her armor gleamed, and her voice carried strength that cut through the worry in their hearts. She told them the enemy would come with all their force, but her people would not bend. She said the foxes of war would lead them into the fight, and the lords who had mocked them would taste the price of their arrogance. Her words lifted the soldiers, and even Matthew felt fire stir in his chest. They swore to stand with her until the last breath. As the sky began to pale with the first light of dawn, horns sounded across the hills. The enemy marched forward, their lines endless, shields raised and spears bristling. The ground shook as they advanced. Banners of many colors waved high, carried by men who believed victory was certain. On the castle walls, Alina raised her hand, her eyes fixed on the sea of steel below. Daniel stood at the gate with his sword ready. Claire held her shield in front of her, her stance firm. Matthew's grip on his spear was tight, his breath fast but steady. The foxes growled low, their bodies tense, waiting for the signal. Elena's voice rang out clear and sharp. She commanded her soldiers to hold until the moment came. Blah! The enemy drew closer, their laughter carrying up the hill as they mocked her walls. Arrows darkened the sky as the first wave began. Shields locked. The enemy pushed forward, pressing against the gates. Elena raised her sword high. With a cry, she gave the order, and the gates burst open, and the foxes poured out like a storm. Their roars tore through the morning air. They leaped into the enemy lines, claws raking, fangs tearing, moving with a fury no man could stop. The enemy's front ranks collapsed under the assault. Men screamed as foxes dragged them to the ground. Spears snapped, shields shattered. Horses reared and bolted as the beasts ripped through the lines. Daniel charged with his men close behind the foxes, cutting down those who tried to fight back. Claire smashed through shields with her own, her blade striking fast. Matthew fought with trembling hands, but the foxes circled him, guarding him as if he were their own. The battlefield turned into chaos. The enemy tried to hold, but the foxes moved too fast, striking and vanishing, only to tear through another line. Soldiers who had mocked now dropped their weapons and fled. Still the foxes chased, hunting them like prey. The ground was slick with blood, the air filled with roars and cries. Elena watched from the walls, her face set like stone, her crown gleaming in the rising sun. By midday, the enemy's front lines had broken. Thousands lay dead in the fields, their banners trampled into the mud. Survivors fled in every direction, their voices filled with terror. The foxes howled in triumph, their cries carrying across the hills. Elena descended from the walls to stand among her soldiers. She raised her sword high and declared that the day was theirs. The soldiers cheered, their voices mixing with the howls of the beasts. Yet as the cheers filled the air, Daniel looked at the foxes and saw the hunger still burning in their eyes. Claire laughed with joy, but Matthew whispered that the war was not over. He said the enemy would return with even greater force, and he feared what the foxes would become when the blood never stopped. Elena heard his words but did not falter. She said, "Let them come, for the foxes of war would rise again." The battlefield was still when the sun began to sink behind the hills. The cries of the dying had faded, leaving only the smell of smoke and blood. Bodies lay scattered across the grass, banners torn and broken. The foxes prowled among the fallen, their jaws dripping red, their eyes glowing like fire in the dusk. The soldiers of Queen Elena stood silent, shaken by both victory and the terror of the beasts that had brought it. Daniel walked among the dead, his sword heavy in his hand. He had seen many battles, but never one so swift and brutal. He knew the foxes had won the day, but he also knew their hunger had not been sated. Claire moved beside him, her shield cracked, her armor dented, but her spirit unbroken. She spoke with pride, saying the world now knew the strength of their queen. Matthew followed behind them, his face pale. He whispered that the foxes were not only weapons but storms that could not be caged. That night, the army camped near the fields of the fallen. Fires burned low as soldiers ate in silence. The foxes gathered at the edge of the camp, their howls rising into the night sky. Some men shivered at the sound, others cheered it, but all knew those beasts were both saviors and shadows. Daniel sat near the flames, sharpening his blade, while Claire laughed with the others, boasting of the fight. Sat apart, watching the foxes with uneasy eyes. He swore he saw them staring back at him, as if they understood his doubt. In the queen's tent, Elena met with her commanders. She told them the enemy had been broken, but more would come. She said the lords who had fled would gather again, and next time they would bring every man they could. She declared that her people must be ready, and that the foxes would lead them once more. Her words were strong, but even she could not ignore the unease in the eyes of her captains. Scouts returned with grim news. Villages loyal to Elena had been burned in revenge. Chains rattled as her people were taken away by enemy soldiers. The lords had not been humbled, but enraged, their pride wounded. They swore to wipe her name from the earth. Already new armies were gathering beyond the horizon, larger and fiercer than before. Time was short. Elena sent Daniel, Claire, and Matthew on missions to strike fear before the armies could unite. With small bands of foxes, they raided supply lines, cut down patrols, and scattered camps. Each time they struck, the foxes grew bolder, their fury sharper. Daniel led them with steady hand, but he could feel their power pressing against his control. Claire thrived in the chaos, her blade flashing, her voice carrying over the roars. Matthew fought bravely, but never stopped fearing what the foxes might do when no enemy was left to kill. One night after a raid, the foxes did not return to the camp at once. Hours passed, and when they came back, their fur was stained with fresh blood, yet no battle had been fought. Daniel demanded to know what they had hunted, but none dared to follow them into the dark. Matthew said they had turned on whatever they could find, beasts of the wild or perhaps worse. Claire silenced him, saying it did not matter. But Daniel could not shake the thought that the foxes were slipping free of the Queen's command. As days passed, fear and awe spread together across the land. Farmers spoke of foxes seen on lonely roads, their eyes burning in the night. Enemy soldiers deserted, too afraid to face the beasts again. Yet whispers also spread within Elena's own ranks. Men wondered if the foxes fought for the crown or only for the blood. Elena heard these whispers, but she stood firm. She told her soldiers that control was hers, and that the foxes were bound to her bloodline by oath of old. She said doubt was the enemy's tool, and unity was their shield. When the enemy returned, their army was vast, stretching farther than the eye could see. The ground shook with their march, drums beating, horns blaring. Elena stood before her people, her sword raised high. She said the day would decide the fate of the world, and that the foxes would strike with fury no army could match. Her soldiers roared, their voices fierce. The foxes howled in answer, their cries rolling like thunder across the plains. Daniel looked at Claire and Matthew. Claire's eyes burned with fire, ready for the storm. Matthew's face was pale, but steady, his spear firm in his hand. Daniel's heart pounded as he gripped his sword. The enemy was close, their banners black against the sky, as the foxes crouched low, their muscles tense, waiting for the Queen's command. The storm was coming, and the foxes of war hungered for it more than ever. The horns of war sounded across the plains as the enemy advanced in a black tide. The earth shook under the weight of countless boots, shields, and war machines. Queen Elena rode at the front of her army, her armor gleaming in the morning light, her sword raised high. Around her the foxes moved like shadows, their eyes blazing, their teeth bared. Behind her, Daniel, Claire, and Matthew stood ready with the soldiers, their hearts pounding as the final battle began. The enemy unleashed their arrows, a storm of iron that darkened the sky. Shields rose to block them, and men cried out as shafts found flesh. Elena's voice rose above the chaos, commanding her people to hold the line. The foxes growled, waiting for her call. When she raised her hand and dropped it, the beasts leapt forward with a roar that shook the heavens. They cut into the enemy ranks like fire through dry grass, tearing, biting, and scattering men who had sworn never to run. Daniel led his soldiers behind the foxes, striking down those who survived their fury. His sword rose and fell, his arm steady, his will unbroken. Claire fought at his side, her shield smashing into enemies, her blade flashing with deadly precision. Matthew moved among them, his spear piercing gaps in armor, his voice calling men to rally when fear threatened to break them. Together they carved a path through the chaos, but still the enemy pressed on, endless in number. The foxes ripped apart war machines, their claws shredding wood and iron. They leaped over walls of shields, scattering soldiers who had never known fear until that moment. Lena rode with them, her sword cutting down lords who dared to challenge her. She became a vision of wrath, a queen crowned not with gold but with fire and blood. Every strike she made drew cries of terror from those who once mocked her name. The enemy brought forth their champions, men clad in black steel who towered over the field. They struck hard, breaking lines, cutting down dozens with each swing. For a moment the tide turned against Elena's forces. Soldiers fell back, fear rising. Then Daniel charged one of the champions, his blade clashing against the heavy axe. The fight shook the ground, sparks flying as steel met steel. Claire and Matthew rushed to his side, striking together until the champion fell with a cry that echoed across the plains. Still more came, and the battle roared like a storm with no end. The foxes fought with savage fury, yet for every enemy they tore apart, two more took their place. Blood stained the earth, and the air was thick with smoke and screams. Alina stood firm, her banner high, her voice calling her people to stand and fight. She reminded them that this was not just a battle for land, but for their very right to live free. Her words cut through fear like a blade, and her soldiers roared with renewed strength. The foxes howled, as if answering her cry. They gathered together, their eyes glowing brighter than ever, their bodies bristling with power. They moved as one, a storm of teeth and fury, and struck deep into the enemy's heart. Then screamed and fled, their courage shattered. The champions fell, one by one, under the queen's sword and the fox's wrath. The black tide began to break. Daniel raised his blade high, shouting that the enemy was faltering. Claire pressed forward with unyielding strength, cutting down those who dared to stand. Matthew drove his spear into the ground and rallied the soldiers, forming them into a wall that pushed the enemy back step by step. The foxes roared with them, and the battlefield shook with the sound. At last the enemy broke. Their lords were dead, their champions fallen, their soldiers fleeing in terror. The plains that had thundered with war now lay silent, but for the cries of the wounded and the low growls of the foxes. Alina stood tall among her people, her sword dripping red, her banner unbroken. The world that had mocked her name now trembled at it. The foxes gathered at her side, their eyes still burning, their bodies still restless. Alina laid her hand upon the head of the largest, whispering words none could hear. The beast bowed its head, as if in respect. Round her, the soldiers knelt, their voices rising in praise of the queen who had led them to victory. Daniel, Claire, and Matthew stood close, their faces scarred, their hearts heavy, but their pride unshaken. The war was over. The foxes had been unleashed, and the world would never forget. From that day forward, no one dared to mock humanity again, for they had seen what slept within the forests, bound to the crown, waiting only for the call of their queen. The foxes of war had answered, and their roar would echo through the ages.